All right. Well, data storytellers. Next episode, advanced business communications for data storytellers series. We're gaining momentum here. So the last episode was Oren Klaff, Pitch Anything and Flip the Script. We looked at some neat tools on how to structure narratives and how to streamline communications, position yourself well in these high stakes settings. And then this one I was really looking forward to. So Dave here is kind of an expert on an author called McRaney. What's his first name?
Dave. Okay.
Yeah. So your name's
How could you forget?
Yeah, I know. I'm blanking. It might be the sleep deprivation from
there you go.
That's my thought. But anyways, I'm as alert as possible because this is about cognitive biases, and I'm super excited to find out more. So, Dave, maybe I'll give you the floor to just kind of intro the episode.
Yeah, man. So this is a fun one. We're gonna cover 3 books. Overall from McRaney. As far as I know, he's only got the 3 books. I say only as if that's not true, as if that's a trivial accomplishment. But this one, these 3 are really interesting. So the first 2, which are You Are Not So Smart and You Are Now Less Dumb, are just like super fun, interesting reads, and they're all about cognitive biases, unproductive heuristics, and so on and so on. And I'll tie that into Klaff because I think there's a heavy connection to Klaff. The third one, which came out much more recently, and that you actually pointed out to me that it had come out, I didn't even know it came out, which is called How Minds Change. And that one felt like just this super exhaustive deep dive into the science of minds changing, which is I really found this one compelling because it's almost like it treats persuasion more like learning than say, I'm going to debate you into submission, right? So if you think about, Cialdini, here's how you can influence. You think about Voss, here's the conversational tactics that you can use to try to, pull someone in your direction. Klaff's talking about the croc brain and frame clashing and all this other stuff. But all 3 of them treat it almost like a battle in some ways. Some are more punchy about it than others, but it's a contest, right? And then when you get to How Minds Change, he comes at it from, I think it was like 2 or 3 different, like very deep bodies of work. And it's framed a lot more like learning. And I think that was the one where I was like, whoa, like all of this stuff swirls together. And when you think about what we're doing as data storytellers, right? What are we? We're like the ivory tower nerds trying to affect change in the organization. We're sort of teaching, we're advising, we can't compel, we can't dictate. And so this notion of framing persuasion as learning was like truly mind-blowing. And so this was the book where I think it inspired us to even go on this journey because I wrote you like that, 32 summary. I was like, dude, this book is amazing. And then you're like, let's do a master class on it. And so here we are. But this episode, I think, ties together the prior ones and then sets us up great for synthesis going in the future. I think that's awesome. Haven't read these yet too, right? So you kind of get this with fresh eyes, right?
Yeah, full disclosure, it was one of those things that top of the reading list and they just couldn't get there. But this gives me the benefit of having kind of like a fresh perspective.
Nice. Okay, I'd be very curious to see where this kind of trips your experiences. How Minds Change is a doozy, but you got to get those first 2, man. They're just fun, and they're not. You can read them in like, okay, sit down, read one cognitive bias, close the book, put it away, wait till tomorrow or something like that. It's not something where you need to go cover to cover. You can just zigzag.
So I can actually just apply discipline, block out like 15, 30 minutes a pop, and just. Okay.
Yeah, I have a copy of Daily Drucker where it basically takes like a whole bunch of Peter Drucker stuff and like, okay, today you're just going to read for like 5 minutes and it condenses a bunch of his stuff. The same idea for those 2. And they're like,
you're selling it well. You're selling it well. Are you into like persuasion and influence? Because you're speaking my language. And it's
man.
I'm busy.
Man. So let's see. We already talked a little bit about recapping it. So let's talk about the connections, right? So Klaff is the one that as I was preparing for this, I kept going back to the crocodile, right? So we talked about a couple things when we talked about class. We talked about the croc brain. Croc brain needs hot cognition. You've got to be interesting or threatening or some other combination thereof, because the croc brain is a cognitive miser, right? A metabolic miser. Brain activity is very expensive. So we have all these evolutionary adaptations to try to save the brain for the good stuff. And one of the other things the croc brain does is it says, can I ignore this without consequence? Or what is the worst possible way to summarize this so that we could just move on to the next thing? And then Claff kind of leaves it alone. He's like, it's happening. I'll teach you how to dodge the croc. But he doesn't talk about what it's doing. If you go through, you are not so smart, you are now less dumb, you're going to get about 30 different cognitive biases. And each of those are essentially the croc brain, and how the croc brain is going to go from, thank you for telling me something, I'm going to package it up in a terrible way, and then I'm going to dismiss you. And you'll be able to almost like see it happening in real time. And now you have a potential way to get a second bite at the apple, as one of my sales friends used to say, because you realize, like, wait a minute, the executive part of the brain didn't reject me. The croc did something stupid, and now I've got to somehow get back into the game and get around the croc. So that's how I would put them together, right? So, if a simple example would be like confirmation bias. We know confirmation bias, right? I'm hunting for evidence that agrees with me. Right? There's something else. It's called like the liaison something reflex. I have it. We'll get to it later. But that's kind of like the opposite of confirmation bias, where you like knee-jerk reject something that contradicts your worldview. That's the croc brain. So if you can see that happening, like, okay, I have to either preempt these two reactions, knowing that I'm vulnerable to them, or if you see it, you might be able to then use the second or the third book, which we'll talk about later on, which is, okay, well, let me take more of like an epistemological approach. Like, okay, what is driving that? How did you reach that conclusion? And try to use the questions, which gets you into hot cognition, gets you engaged, but also make space for them to realize that they're kind of screwing up a little bit. And then they can learn their way into your conclusion. And so you think about like Voss, especially with his calibrated questions, this explains why calibrated questions are so good. In Voss's case, it's a little bit more of like, keep them talking, but also you can make your problem their problem. You can use no to get to yes. In this case, it's like, well, hold on. Pull out all of those little underlying feelings, assumptions, and backgrounds, get them on the table, and then you can kind of say, like, what if that was wrong? Or what would you do if that was wrong? And that little like chipping away is what creates some space for learning, and then create space for persuasion. So there's 3 books, so we're cheating, right? Because we got 3 books here. We talked about 3 books already, so it's kind of like a 1-for-1. But like that's how this all kind of fits in, and that's why this is coming at the end, because once you start treating persuasion as learning, I think it completely changes your approach to how you engage with the business. So a lot in the intro there, but like, anything you want to pick apart at before we go into the cognitive biasy stuff?
I already have a bunch of connections going off, and I'm sure that as we go along, maybe they would be more appropriate, but just a few notes there. So it's interesting to me that now you mentioned that, if we look at influence, that was like principles of how influence works on a psychological level. That's like the lay of the land, right? And then we looked at Voss. It was also very tactical. It was more about like, how do you navigate that landscape effectively to kind of reach some mutually beneficial solutions, conclusions. And then Claff came in with, that was probably the most quote unquote combative of like, no, you really need to sell an idea. That's the idea that you need to sell. You have a limited amount of time, super busy stakeholder who doesn't really care, probably hates you. Obviously exaggerating, but you need to, one bullet in the chamber needs to find a hole. And it's interesting to me that the most collaborative approach, so to say, Voss is very collaborative, but in this case, I would say the softest approach is like, okay, let's frame this as a learning experience. first of all, it's interesting to me that that's what's like you found the clef connection to be the most relevant there. And it makes sense because if you think about the main takeaways for data professionals from CLAF was actually the whole cognitive master concept that you just mentioned with the croc brain, right? So if you look at all the things, well, just pay attention to that what's happening there. And then later on, if you remember, at the very end of the episode, we looked at some of those tools, including the flash roll. But one of those ideas was the quote unquote inception of how do you get someone to sell your idea for you by actually participating in the process. And it seems to me, and again, maybe it will come later when we hash this out, that by engaging in that kind of process, first of all, that's what learning is. Learning does not take place passively, right? So it needs to be like a participatory process. But with that, maybe that's how you shortcut those cognitive bias tripwires. I don't know how we'll look at it, by actually not force feeding information. And if you're a data professional, you're presenting information. You constantly need to, what you're selling is the information, right? Mm-hmm. Yep. So I can already see how this might work out. So I'm even more excited now to dive in.
Right on. And so then let's dive in hard, right? So let's talk about You Are Not So Smart, You Are Less Dumb. By the way, these are two separate books, but really like you could bind them into one mega book and it would be more or less the exact same experience, because he's kind of cataloging these cognitive biases, heuristics, and other sort of shortcuts that are ultimately counterproductive. But it all originates with the same explanation for the croc brain. The brain is expensive, and if we had to critically examine everything, we would never do anything because we're constantly bombarded with information. So we have to filter, compress, summarize, shortcut. That is exactly what the brain is doing all the time, right? Like if you could constantly feel your clothes all day, you would go insane. Think of it that way. So there is pressure on every square inch of your skin, but your brain's like, no, I'm good. I don't need to worry about that, right? Mm-hmm. You're suddenly hyper aware of your socks right now, which is kind of funny too. So
exactly what's going on.
Right. Now let's bring this to the corporate setting, because this is where like the machinery that allowed us to survive in the jungle, like, ooh, that's a rustling in the bushes. Is that a tiger? I can't wait to find out. I say, rustle, bush, out. Okay? Because the cost of being wrong is you get eaten by a tiger. In a corporate setting, the cost of being wrong is usually separated, and this is important, from the action of being wrong. And let me explain. There's two ways it can be separated. One is the intertemporality of the timing. Okay, I'm wrong today. I'm actually wrong today, but we don't find out for a year or 6 months or more, right? Think about like how many corporate executive case studies where they're like, oh, this actually was set in motion, 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 10 years ago, right? Like Jack Welch, for example, right? I saw like a little documentary about Jack Welch. This guy had GE as the belle of the ball, prettiest girl at the prom. Everybody wanted that stock, drove it up, I don't know, some crazy number, like 800%. He walks away. The whole thing kind of collapses. They start doing some forensics. They're like, holy goodness, this guy was doing some pretty wacky things. But he was already long gone. So you could argue like, okay, he might have been right in the moment, but he was wrong long term. But the wrongness didn't manifest until he was long gone. Okay, so there's a time problem with a lot of the decisions that we make, because these are not tigers in a bush. These are multi-pronged, multi-layered, multi-quarter business decisions. And then the second one is the cost of being wrong is frequently not borne by the person who is wrong, right? Again, I'm not going to turn this into a commentary on contemporary, business, but how often do executives kind of tank a company? They get a golden parachute, they walk away, and then you have all these layoffs where people like lose their livelihoods, they lose their homes, they lose whatever. Like that's genuine suffering, but they wouldn't do anything wrong. That was the top brass. So you have two layers of wrongness that these cognitive biases are kind of unchecked because they don't even know. There's no feedback loop, right? Mm-hmm. Most people, if they're wrong and they're shown that they're wrong, they make an adjustment, right? You and I both done sports. If I go to do a move wrong, or if I do a play wrong, I fail in real time. I learn in real time. I adjust in real time. But if I fail in this play the football game. Okay, first down, I make a mistake, but I don't find out until 2 weeks later. Like, oh, well, I can't do anything about it. All right, same reason why if you give feedback to someone, 6 months ago you typoed that email and made the company look bad. Well, 6 months, man. How many more emails have gone by? So that is a big factor. And then there's an ego factor. Cognition is your thought process, your brain, your judgment. And for me to say, hey, Mr. CEO, you're actually not very good at thinking. It's okay. It's part of being human. It's not you personally. It's the human condition. That is going to have a massive ego shield because, well, the reason they make, the 280 times the average worker is because presumably they have minimally 280 times better judgment. In theory, right? This is all in theory. So for you to say, I'm the data executive or data professional, I'm trying to affect the behavior of an executive who's priding themselves on their decision making, and I'm like, well, by the way, your decision could be better. That's another barrier too, just an ego barrier. So you've got all these different factors that kind of allow these inefficiencies in how we think to kind of go unchecked. You get a nice cross section of business leaders that you work with because of data storytellers. I mean, how's this resonating with your cross section?
100%. I mean, especially from the perspective of if we zoom out and we look at the pain points that constantly come up with senior leaders. And a lot of times it's like, hey, my team, for some reason, when they go out into the business, they just not received well. They have these are PhDs, they bring high quality information and it just bounces back from the business. And the ego thing is what all that you said, super, relevant and true, but especially the ego thing. So it reminds me also of some self-reflection. I hate criticism, but I invite it all the time. And yet when I receive it, I still hate it. And it still has like an emotional impact. So it's just how things are. And in a business setting, especially when I think people are constantly in the mode of demonstrating their value, right? I think the threat of their ego being attacked, I think it's even more hypersensitive. Plus, it has to do with, I think, the biggest risk in a business setting, interestingly enough, on a personal level, is the reputation. So, and your reputation is kind of tied into you as an individual and your identity. We can probably not going to go into the whole structure of, the ego relating to your identity and all that, but just for the sake of this conversation, definitely, I think that the cognitive biases that are connected to preserving the integrity of the ego is probably the biggest tripwire that I see. And exactly what you said, like people, executives that pride themselves on making good decisions, and that's what they are paid to do, to make good decisions. But now you come in and say that, hey, not only I can actually happy to make better decisions, but the implication there is that you're not good at your job. And even business executives would say, no, absolutely, bring me the data. I will approach it with humility. It's just not how it works. In a real life setting, you'll still get these negative emotions kind of polluting that interaction. Exactly what Voss says, right? So actually the Voss techniques are all about how to minimize the negative emotion, how to bring as much truth up as possible, right? So it seems to me that this resonates with it so well. Like these cognitive biases are these tripwires that once you actually trigger it, then there's like a burst of negative emotion that will just completely sabotage whatever you're trying to do. So that's my only comment there.
No, that's a good point. And that ego thing, I forgot about that as I was planning for this. I was like, oftentimes, like we are kind of the bearers of bad news, right? I used to, it's not fun to tell someone like, hey, that broker that you play golf with every week and you send each other Christmas cards and, you're their kid's godfather, whatever. You make the relationship as intense as you want, right? They haven't sold a case in 5 years. Like, you got to stop talking to them. Nobody wants to hear that. That's a terrible thing to say because, again, hey, your judgment's a little bit sus there, buddy, because you're making all this investment in someone that has no business benefit. So you're right, and that's when you're going to run into the ego, and that's where that's like with that Nigel. I'm gonna kick myself as soon as we get to that page because I'm going to see how it's properly pronounced. But like that reflex of like paradigm breaking stuff and how you throw up armor to defend yourself from it. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And,
very interesting. And by the way, now that you just mentioned the bearer of bad news, just recently rewatched the Two Towers of Lord of the Rings, probably for the 20th time. And when Gandalf goes into the Hall of Theoden and then Grima tells him that, hey, the bearer of bad news, they're not welcome. And then whatever Gandalf says, he's the wizard, he's bringing the bad news, but with the intent of actually like freeing the king from that chokehold that he has, and that he's old, he's not receptive, go away. But then once the magic's applied, then breaks through the barrier, and now Theoden is very open to the truth and welcomes whatever the bad news are, but also is now willing to take action. Right, so I kind of look at it this way: as like, hey, here's the magic, here's a tool that you can use to break through that.
Yeah, so all these cognitive biases are Grima Wormtongue, and we are Gandalf. As if we
I'm trying to put it in the framework of a good story.
as if we did need to push the data professionals further into the ivory tower, and now we're Gandalf. Okay, that works.
That was exactly my goal. So.
Yeah. Okay. So there's like these two books together have over 30 cognitive biases. Okay, and some of them are going to be more relevant than others. As we were thinking about this, right, there are a few that are like hyper relevant that I have got firsthand experience dealing with pretty much all of these, right? Mm-hmm. So one is the halo effect, right? Halo effect is essentially if the leader of the department is well liked, or at least politically well positioned, then everything they do is going to be held in higher regard. Okay. So if you think about that, what does that mean? Well, that means you need relationships. That means you can't just be I'm Mr. Cold Cognition, facts and just the facts. I'm smarter than you, so you should listen to me. Like that abrasive, I'm right, so just shut up and listen to me. Like that can't work. I mean, this guy I used to work with told me a story of a data scientist talking to I think it was a vice president, and literally was like, "You're an idiot. Just do what we say. It's all in the data," something like that. In a meeting in front of all, like, way to completely destroy the relationship, right? But this person had zero social skills. And so that's an extreme example of like the halo. It's like the horns effect, right? Like how much work did we have to do to overcome that old perception? Mm-hmm. But with halo, so if you can get in and you do well and you do good work, you have good relationships, it allows you to kind of I call it earn complexity, mm-hmm. which is where that's how I treat the halo effect. So give me something that's a little bit dumb, give me something that's a little bit below my license. Let me crush it, but let me use that as a scaffolding to keep working forward to get to more interesting, more compelling, more exciting, more difficult stuff. Because once they kind of trust me and they like me, and then suddenly you transition from being an indispensable partner instead of being that disposable cost center. So everything we've talked about so far is basically interpersonal dynamics, relationships, all that kind of fun stuff. That's what this really hey, halo effect. Have a good relationship. You can kind of run a little bit more freely than you would otherwise. Mm-hmm. Anything you want to add in?
No, 100%. And now that you mentioned it, even if you look at any kind of best practice, marketing funnel, sales funnel, where again, this is earned complexity. That's what you do. With complexity comes bigger commitments, both financially, time-wise. People are willing to take bigger risks, if you earn that kind of trust. So the difference between, downloading a free ebook and then signing up for a 2-year contract for $250,000, right? It can be the same organization, same product ecosystem, but the difference between the two is at the end of the spectrum, you have the earned complexity. And if you look at, what was earned? Well, that was earned, that the relationship, which was built with trust. And it's very useful, even when you put it this way, because this is practically how it plays out. But this is just a halo effect working. So now you know that, okay, what I have to shoot for is to have that halo effect because it's just a cognitive bias. So.
Yes. Yep. The next one is my favorite because I have been in this. I got like probably 30 different funny ones for this one, but confirmation bias. I talked about it a little bit earlier, but confirmation bias. So executives, again, they're praised for their judgment. The data science organization often occupies a subordinate role to that executive. So you will end up with, and it's almost inevitable, hey, tell me why I'm right. Go do a project. I have an idea. I want you to go do a project to support that idea. Right? I can't give the example without outing who did this, but there was a project in a prior role where it was literally like I attempted to do this objectively, and they were like, hey, we don't actually want things that contradict the presupposed conclusion. So you brought us 10 things. We're going to peel off those 3. We're going to go with a 7-point treatise on why this is the greatest thing ever. But that's not business, not science. So this is super double-edged sword, because when that executive leaves, they seem to always do, you're now like, okay, well, who am I supposed to graft onto, because I've sort of sold out my credibility. In my opinion, credibility is the most important thing for data science, because otherwise you're not trustworthy. And we're literally trying to be truth merchants, right? So if they're like, well, you just basically bend the numbers to suit whomever is currently like your VP du jour, you're not credible at all. So why would someone on the at the desk level who's actually affected by this, right? Maybe the executive. I'll do a sales example. This is purely hypothetical. This did not happen. Hey, I think that this broker is the best broker, and I want you to kind of bend the analysis so I look like I'm a genius. Okay, great. Desk level, where their commission is directly affected by which brokers they work with. No, I'm not. Data science can go pound sand. I know that broker sucks. Oh, okay. Right. So you could see where, then you can't get the maximum impact, because there's one executive, there's thousands of salespeople. So if I'm trying to get the salespeople to change behaviors, I've got to be credible to them. So how do you get around this? Because this is one that I wanted to tackle. You can do this. It's kind of like the halo effect, where you can do the analysis. They're not stupid people, usually. So there's probably some truth into that hypothesis that they led with. I say, oh, by the way, I found this too. What do you think of this? And then you can kind of, again, make room for learning. So they're like, you and I, the case study about commercial segments, right? I think it was like movie theaters and grocery stores, right? To keep the proprietary stuff off out of the spotlight. You told me you thought it was going to be grocery stores. I did the analysis on grocery, did my due diligence. I'm not being insubordinate. I'm not being difficult to work with. There is a legitimate market in the grocery stores. By the way, while I was doing market research, I found movie theaters. What do you think about that? And then shut up. We're going to steal from how minds change. But no one ever thought of that. I'm learning about movie theaters as an industry, as a market now. So that is probably the safest way to help kind of get around that, so you don't just become a pawn for someone else.
And this is, again, like framing it as learning, right? Yeah. And not very different from when the whole pacing and leading idea. And this is very sales marketing. Okay, I have something. I need to meet you first so I can leave you to something better and bigger and brighter. And in this case too, it's a simple, this idiot, they thought it was the movie theaters, but as opposed to, listen to me, because, here's the gospel, but no, it's like, you're absolutely right. Now this person is open to learning. I love it. And might I mention here that I did use this framing of, data analytics professionals are the purveyors of truth. But I think an even better way to look at this, as you said, the merchants of truth.
We're merchants of truth.
Because first of all, it's a business. So I think the analogy will work well on multiple levels that way. Plus, as a data analytics professional, first of all, you need to get that merchant buys and sells stuff, acquires and then distributes. You need to get the truth first. So, the whole question about data quality and the platforms, and to make sure that the truth is as close to the truth as possible in the business setting. And then, yes, it's not, your job is not done yet, but then as a merchant, you need to sell it. You need to make sure that people will actually buy what you're selling. And on top of that, it's so cool that in that act, there will be all kinds of temptations without even posing this as a moral issue. The credibility. The temptation will be to bend the knee by bending the numbers, as you said. But now, in this case, no, there is a very practical, tangible, even, regardless of the moral connotations here, your credibility as a truth merchant is one of your most powerful sales tools, if you think about it that way. So I love that framing. And then, as a more tactical move here, you sell it by framing it as novel information, the context of learning. Even more tactical is meeting the person where they are. So I love this because it goes from the biggest possible picture to the most actionable tactical steps. So I love it.
Yep. And we got this notion of anchoring, which I think Cialdini talks about anchoring, like, it's you walk into a store and they have all the super expensive stuff up front. So like, oh man, $200 sweater, get out of here. $100 sweater. Well, that's so much more reasonable. It's like, bro, it's $100 sweater. That's not reasonable, generally speaking. So like the first impression sticks. And even if it's a bad one, even if it's factually false, we have this innate human glitch where the first knowledge becomes champion and everything else has to dethrone it. Now, if it's a really bad nugget of information, it's easy to dethrone it, right? If it's obviously wrong, like, Laz has green hair. That was right because I saw a weird picture of you. Oh, wait, no, he doesn't have green hair. Never mind. That was silly. But I had to be proved wrong because if all I saw was that picture of you where the lighting and the angle was weird and you had green hair, I'd tell everybody I know, Laz has green hair, right? So you need to bump that out of the way because once it gets in there, it's there. Right. There was that was a silly example. Here's a real example. At some point in my early education, I was taught that spider monkeys are called spider monkeys because they have like a web-like pattern in their facial fur. And I'm 39. So let's pretend I learned that as a 9-year-old wee lad, 9-year-old Dave. 30 years. I have thought spider monkeys are called that because they have a web pattern in their face. It turns out they are called spider monkeys because they have extra long limbs and it makes them look spider-like. Okay? So you can imagine my shock when my daughter, who's now into animals, a spider monkey because of the limbs. I was like, no, sweetheart, it's because of the markings.
You're like, that's cute. That's cute. But...
Right. So we pull up the book, and the book says, there's spiders. And I looked at Wikipedia, same thing. I was like, okay, I've been walking around my whole life thinking this completely wrong information. I was anchored to that, where like when my daughter, who's actually reading a book about animals, kind of like pokes her head up, spider monkey because of spider limbs. And I'm like, that can't be right. No. While she's literally holding a book. Right. So
that's ridiculous.
Right. I was anchored to the face fur. So that's an example of anchoring. And it's a stupid one. Like my life was not better or worse because I thought it was the webbing on the face. And it's not better or worse because it's the limbs. Right. But like, I was anchored to it, and I was propagating that misinformation if anybody ever asked me about spider monkeys. So the best way you can tap into that, though, because if we're constantly working, right? The data science team doesn't sleep, right? No breaks on this train. Proactively share stuff. Bring people in early. Like the worst thing you could do is spend 6 months in the tower, lock the doors, close the curtains, come out and be like, I solved something. Who knows what the hell was getting in there to anchor before you got to it. Because chances are, if you started working on something, there's questions going around. And there's lots of low-hanging fruit to answer questions superficially. You never want to go into the back room for 6 months and not say anything. First of all, it's bad project management, but also that's just letting other people anchor. Like, we did a ton of work to find out that there was something in the neighborhood like 2 million businesses in America that could buy insurance when I was at the other place, right? We answered that question proactively. We're pushing that to everybody because I didn't want someone to be like, it's 4. Anchor, and now I got to justify why I'm coming in at 2. Instead of saying it's 2, it is 2, it is 2, it's 2, it's been 2, it will continue to be 2, right? But if someone anchors, you have to defend yourself. Even as like, well, where the hell did they get the 4 from, right? So anyway, proactively sharing allows you to anchor. Simple as that. Be more inclusive when you're doing your data science. Yeah, go ahead. I can tell you when I get in there, you're excited.
There's so much there because it's so cool with the spider monkey example.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm constantly like translating. Okay, how can you apply this principle and then avoid being hit and sidetracked by a cognitive bias of such sort? Now, what could your daughter do better or differently? Not like what was possible, but what could she have done differently so that you welcome that information right away or easily, or make that transition and not shatter your world and kind of force you to check out 5 different websites and, Encyclopedia Britannica before actually yielding to the truth? First of all, if she knew that you have the misconception of thinking that spider monkeys are called spider monkeys because of the web pattern, right? She could have said that, wow, did you know, Dad, that contrary to popular belief, or contrary to what many think about the facial patterns, right? It turns out that it's actually because of so even if she did that, do you think that would have made it easier? That's my first question, for you to accept it.
I think opening with a question is always better than opening with a statement, but I think using a yes/no question is potentially like it closes the door, and yes/no statements are often yes/no questions often come across as statements that end in a question mark. Mm-hmm, like, did you know, contrary to popular belief, it's the limbs? You could have gotten the exact same reaction by being like, it's the limbs, dude. Right? So it might be more, so again, trying to like make this very applicable, very tactical. It's probably more like, hey, they got these cool things. They're called spider monkeys, right? What do you think is the origin of the name?
Exactly. That's what that's what I was actually driving towards, because actually knowing.
That's
great
because in the dark arts, lads. Like,
I was kind of leading you, but I didn't understand who I'm up against. So because my point would have been that it might have made it easier, but come on, like she adds the chance that she can know all this in advance is not realistic, but she can shortcut it by starting with a question. Exactly was going to be my point. It's like, hey, Dad, why do you think they are called? Right? And then you say, well,
why? How do you think?
You don't do it right. You see, you're like, yeah, you got me there. So
red
exactly,
belts, buddy, red belts, yeah,
exactly. That's what I'm like. Okay, there's still a misalignment. I'm learning, and I'm in a space of learning. So yes, by opening up with that question, then she kind of just sidesteps your cognitive bias and then makes you. So what do you think would have been the perfect scenario in that case that she could have done even without knowing where you stand on the spider monkey question? So
you have like there's 2 layers to this, which I think is super fascinating. So the first is how can she know if I'm already pre-anchored? Which is a big problem. Like, so like, if I walk into someone's office and hey, there's 2 million businesses in America, or hey, the average hourly rate for an MD is $250. Right? I need to figure out, okay, is there an anchor that I have to overcome, or do I get to be the anchor? Right? So there could be a yes/no question, like, hey, have you ever heard of spider monkeys, or like, how familiar are you with spider monkeys? And that might have opened the space for me to volunteer my anchor. Like, oh yeah, spider monkeys because of the facial pattern. Then she can like pause. Plan, okay, this guy's got an anchor. He thinks it's the webbing on the face or the facial fur pattern. I need to figure out a way. Yeah, right. My dad's an idiot, but like also like how can I guess first of all, like, is this important to change? Like, do I have anything to gain by teaching him that it's the limbs? Does he have anything to gain by updating his model of the spider monkey world? And then, okay, now what's the best? If somehow we decide, okay, the world is a better place when he knows why they're called spider monkeys, what's the safest way to kind of pull him into exploring it? Right? And And then that would be like the strategy. Now, I don't have like a particularly strong investment in this question, so I haven't done the mental work, but this is work of figuring out the exact tactics to affect this change. If you left me alone for 30 minutes, I could probably figure out like the right way to do it. But again, we're talking about spider monkeys and 7-year-olds here. But to make it to a real scenario, right? It is like, hey, how many businesses do you think are in America? And if they give you a number, like, oh, okay, where'd that number come from? How did you get that number? What do you think about that number? Like, what do you think in terms of other relations to other things? How credible is the source? How credible do you think the source is? How would it change your strategy if it was a different number? Right? How would you react if I said it was if I told you I had incredibly robust analysis and data that says it was closer to 2 million than 4 million? Well, considering the total number of registered businesses in the country is in neighborhood of 22 million, 4 versus 2, it's a doubling, but you're still essentially conceding that the vast majority of the total businesses are actually out of market. So it's probably not super material, but it does allow you to get more accurate like share of market calculations, which are important, right? But I don't think it would fundamentally warp anybody's strategy. So it's a low cost update. Now, if the total universe was 5 and I said, well, the actual addressable market is 2, not 4, well, now I've cut it in half, but I've basically, like, I've tripled the unreachable market, which sucks, right? So I think that helps to kind of, again, what's the cost of you being wrong? And what's the benefit of me updating you? That has to be part of these anchoring factors, because if your anchor is good enough, then leave it, because it's not going to hurt anybody. If someone's walking around thinking that the average hourly rate for a doctor is $240 and I say it's $250, like, okay, but it runs from $125 to over $1,000. So it's like, how much benefit does that precision give you? Probably nothing. So why am I going to fight to make you believe me that it's $250, not $240? You know what I mean? But if the entire universe was, say, 200 to 300, and I moved you, that could be material. So,
and then it changes your strategy on how you're gonna. Very interesting.
Because it might actually affect what you do after that conversation's over. But if I've got other agenda items, I can also pick and choose my battles, which is another part of being a good data science professional, especially at the executive level. Because I might have 10 things that I'm correct about empirically, maybe not the truth, big T, but empirically. And I don't need all 10 of them to get past the goalie to accomplish my goals, which is a vast thing. Like, okay, what's your must-have, nice-to-have? Same thing for you, and hopefully we can kind of meet somewhere.
Yeah, and the question with this is always like how much you can actually prepare in advance, how much you need to decide in the moment, right? Yeah. And then as you get better at the skill, then your ability to be able to make the right call in a shorter period of time, that's what increases. But the first step is just to know that it's happening.
Yep. There, the Semmelweis reflex. There it is. We got
Semmelweis reflex. Is it because of Semmelweis the doctor? The same doctor who...
I think it's named after him. But this is the one where, like, this is probably the biggest data science one. Like, we are potentially a frame clash, if you want to go clap for a minute. But like, hey, here's something you didn't know. And I'm going to flip the entire cognitive apple cart because it's going to violate your operating thing. The market segment's the best example. Everybody and their mother, market, grocery stores. Yeah, fine, you can sell it to grocery stores. I'm not trying to say that there's not a grocery store market, but like, holy crap, guys, have you looked at the movie theater market? And everybody starts from no, because they're like, no, I'm an executive. I've been doing this for 30 years. You've been doing this for 30 minutes. I don't care that you've got all this great empirical stuff. I can't let you challenge my ego.
Yeah.
And so everyone starts at no. Now we know from Voss, you can use that to your advantage by asking in a way where no turns. Like, hey, would it be ridiculous to find out that there's actually a large market in movie theaters? You can be like, what did you drink the last time you watched a movie in the theater with your family? Oh, soda. Okay, you want to go sell soda to movie theaters, right? So like, there's ways to get there, right? But that, like, I found something in the data that you've never saw before, knee-jerk reaction, shut it down. Like, and then it could even get into like, false attribution. Well, you don't know anything about you're bad. You're naive. You're not experienced. You're being mathematical, not businesslike, and yada. All these different like potential ad hominem type stuff that can happen when you come at somebody with something never seen before. So that's again, go back to the proportionality. Okay, what's the cost of them being wrong? What do they stand to lose if this kind of punches through? How much ego shield is there? Is this worth the fight, or should you save the fight for something else? I mean, early in my career, and I still have a bit of a bad habit. I have a bad habit of fighting for all 10 things. So like you gotta pick your battles. I say that as much for my own benefit to hear it, right? But there's a term for it, the Semmelweis reflex. If you're gonna try to violate someone's paradigm, you try to break their frame, they're gonna harden it up. And so you need to know that that's going to happen, and especially if you're going to shock them with something from the data. Very, very common, very, very easy thing for data scientists, because we get excited. Oh my God, I found something that no one's ever seen before. I'm so innovative. Semmelweis reflex. They're going to try to shut you down and call you a blasphemer or heretic or something like that.
Semmelweis example
make you wear the scarlet pie on your shirt, like the...
Exactly. Actually, the Semmelweis. Do you know the story, Semmelweis?
It's in the book, but like it's been a while. I just remembered the cognitive bias. Is that this is one that.
Okay, so I have unique access to this story because I'm Hungarian. Semmelweis was a Hungarian doctor.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. So at the time, I think it was the time of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I'm not gonna go. Don't worry.
And then World War One. Nice. Okay, here we go. All right.
So, here's the anecdote.
This led to World War One. Yeah. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So I think it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time. I might be wrong, by the way. So don't fact check me because I will have a Semmelweis reflex. So
now I'm anchored.
Basically. Yeah, and at the time that was so the doctors in the Austro-Hungarian Empire were like world leading, the edge of the knife, the best doctors in the world, super educated. The academy was world class, and then Semmelweis was a Hungarian doctor working with the Austrians, and what happened is that infant mortality was huge.
I know this story.
It was huge.
I know this story. Yeah.
Yes.
I know this from epidemiology, but I didn't know the guy's name. Okay.
Yeah, it's outrageous. I think his name was Imre Semmelweis, by the way. And
sounds right.
The biggest Hungarian medical university is named after him, by the way. And it's like, okay, why are all these kids dying? That's just like the modus operandi. And Semmelweis, this was around the time when germ theory was introduced and all that, and he kind of made the connection of, hey, wait a second, there are these germs, and doctors were not washing their hands before actually delivering babies, right? So they went from doing surgery somewhere, all the gunk, and they were not washing their hands. And Semmelweis said that, hey, this is a problem, and this is why it's a problem. So stop it. Like, you need to wash your hands. Now, this is what he said. It's like, hey, here's the data. Here's the hypothesis rooted in data. If we just change this, it's a small sacrifice to make. We can save millions of babies, probably like hundreds and billions in the future, right? So just do it. It's like low risk. But he did not understand that the risk was not like, oh, am I going to spend 3 seconds on washing my hand? The risk was that what he was telling the academy is that you guys are supposed to be the most knowledgeable, you're supposed to be the experts on this, but you've been killing millions of babies because you're so stupid that you did not discover this simple fact, which is actually pretty straightforward. And they just rejected him. It's like, this is ridiculous, right? And it's such a great example too, because not only did this happen, but he went insane. Like Semmelweis went insane because he was like, I can't. He couldn't process the fact that they did not accept this simple truth. So actually died in a mental institution. Interestingly enough. Wow. It's a genius. Yeah, exactly. So this just shows you that you can bang your head against the wall. And it was just about, if he posed that finding the right way, anticipating the cognitive bias to kick in. At the time, it wasn't called the Semmelweis reflex, because he was the first case example, I guess, that in the historical proportion. Then he could have saved it, and probably also could have saved hundreds of millions of lives until they actually accepted it, I think, like decades later.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of like having a disease named after you. They're like, oh, good news and bad news. The good news is we're naming this after you. The bad news is, But I think lots of people that are tuning into this can empathize with it being driven into an asylum by your counterparties' refusal to accept the empiricism. But there's something that we're going to take a hard 90 on this one, because there's something really cool about these cognitive biases that I think is overlooked when you study them, right? And you read the books, and you're like, okay, I'm preparing to go talk to these executives, and I know all the little glitches in the matrix that these executives are about to commit, and I'm going to get through that croc brain. I'm going to catch them when they're committing the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, and I'm going to catch them when they are anchored, and I'm going to catch them when they're doing recency bias, right? All these other fun things. And then we forget we're just as susceptible to this stuff as the next person. We're all human. And I know that's a cliche, but it's like we all have the same machinery between our ears. Now, data scientist is a little bit more mathematically inclined, and we have all of this training, which is good scientific training is supposed to insulate you from cognitive bias. But this is where economics gets to kick science in the stomach, because we're also incentivized creatures. And so, there's the whole like reproducibility crisis in scientific studies right now, because this entity sponsors this study and gives a grant to this researcher. Of course they're going to have a confirmation bias problem. They might even disclose, oh, by the way, my study on the benefits of breakfast cereal was funded by General Mills, right? So there is a conflict of interest here, but those don't get the same attention as the abstract, which is like eating cereal makes you more handsome. Like, oh my God, like all I have to do is eat my way to a better face. So like that stuff doesn't happen. And those guys are trained scientifically to avoid confirmation bias and other things. But if $1 million is $1 million, you know what I mean? So it's like, to take the punchline from a completely different joke, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, right? But it's like, we're all susceptible to it. And some of them, which I've curated for this conversation, are even more deadly when we do it, because it plays to our strengths. So you could potentially not only be blind to the fact that you're doing it, but you're going to do it way better than everybody else. You know what I mean? It's kind of like you have a supercar, and then you're going to drunk drive the supercar. Whereas like someone could be like drunk driving a bicycle. It's like, okay, fine, haha. One person gets hurt. Drunk driving a Mack truck, because that's what happens when you combine maybe like, let's call it elevated elite cognitive horsepower with a bias that's undermining the whole thing. So just to quickly rattle a few of them up. Confirmation bias. Good Lord, a data scientist who wants to commit confirmation bias is probably going to do it the absolute best, right? No, because think about it. We write the SQL. We pick the sources, right? If you need something quickly, you can always use Google. Phrase your query in a way like, find me articles that agree with me. Great. I just found 10 white papers from McKinsey and Bain and whatever. I'm sure they have the exact counterpoint in a different paper from a different year, but okay, I got the ones I needed from McKinsey. So they got that. Or, I think I'm going to exclude these records because they don't fit my preconceived notion. So, we're doing all this stuff kind of like, under the cover of darkness. No one's going to know, right? And that could be completely unconscious, right? Because it'll make the analysis easier. Or maybe you're going to, I don't want to get yelled at and have to push the rope and ice skate uphill because I'm going to find something contentious. Let me just sweep the contentious stuff out of the way. It's easier. I'm still going to get my paycheck. Everyone's going to be happy. And again, the cost of being wrong is 6 months from now, I probably got a new job by then. So confirmation bias, we do that with a NOS booster in our car. Availability heuristic, where you over-rotate on easily acquired data. You wanna ask a data scientist, what's your favorite part of data science? Feature engineering is not on the list. Feature engineering is the worst part. Data munging and feature engineering are the worst part of the tradecraft. All right. My current role, I'm very fortunate. I get to do like executive board presentation type stuff, and I get to build models. If I told you the amount of time I have to spend on munging, it's awful. I forgot how bad it is, right? So what would be the easier thing to do? Don't munge. Just take whatever's inside the table in already nice, neat tabular form. Okay, but there's a lot of value in the munging. There's a lot of value in the feature engineering. So if you're going to over-rotate on the available stuff, you're going to end up doing it wrong, right? Anchoring, we're just as susceptible to anchoring as the next person. First impressions, like when I start any job, any consulting engagements, like, let me learn about you. That first conversation is going to have a massive effect on like the next conversation, because I'm going to start to tailor my questions and my analysis based on that first person. So we're just as vulnerable there. Overfitting, it's in the name, right? We can very, very easily use excessive complexity to get better performance metrics, but then we might be lacking the ability to apply this stuff outside of our training data, outside of the warm embrace of our private computer. And then finally, hindsight bias, which is deadly. Rationalizing your model is correct, even with things that it couldn't. You can lead the witness, where like now it's almost like hindsight bias for a data scientist is almost like forcing the other person to engage in confirmation bias, right? This just happened this week. I was talking to a colleague. Absolutely, I'm going to send this person, chocolates and stuff, because they were giving the model credit for stuff that the model had absolutely no ability to detect. Right? The model was wrong. Sorry, it was right for the wrong reasons. Right? So the model said, hey, this is not a very good listing. And he's like, man, I don't know how it did that. Like everything looked great, but then this like weird thing happened on the phone and we lost the listing in a torpedo. How did you know that? I didn't. No, you can't give me credit for that. Like I was vigilant about that bias, right? But I could have easily been like, yeah, man, that must be like a third order interaction effect inside this model that I could, right? My model's better than that. Right. So those 5 are like the 5 deadly sins of cognitive biases for data science professionals. Right. Now, those are my 5. I mean, any for you that you've seen, again, you have that advantage. You get to talk to lots of different data scientists, or even just, when you did sales coaching too. But like, how do the supposed experts in this stuff come up short with biases?
So this is actually like so illuminating to me, because honestly, like to that level, to that granularity, when you can point these out, that these are the 5 deadly cognitive biases, because for the reasons that you mentioned, and from my perspective, so for example, I couldn't name you more because this is already like beyond my scope and ability to the granularity, but from the big picture. So the whole idea of you not being able to get your ideas through because they are being tripped up by cognitive biases, often you can lose sight of the fact that it goes both ways. So it's just like, the whole data literacy thing that I mentioned last time of, oh yeah, the business does not have the data literacy, so that's why this is just not working, even though it might be true, but also you don't have the right level of business literacy or not using the right language market fit. this is the same. Yeah, all these biases are at work in your stakeholders, but you can figure that out on kind of like the offense side of things. But you also need to do your own housekeeping to make sure that you keep it clean, because at the end of the day, the interaction and the exchange will be sabotaged by it wherever that cognitive bias takes place, and it's not being, treated or contextualized properly. It's not overcome, right? So actually would be able to give you more of these biases just off the cuff, because also especially the confirmation bias is just so huge in general. It's like so ubiquitous as well. I would say that's the biggest one. That's the biggest one at play, for all the reasons that we mentioned, including the ego preservation and everything else at stake. But I'm also now thinking about I'm already thinking about like the synthesis side of things, of like, oh wow, in terms of the playbook that you can use to just elevate the quality of your interactions and your communication, this is just so neat. So in terms of, these are super high ROI things if you just focus on in this case, the 5 deadly ones, to make sure that it doesn't really hit you in the face. So yeah, those are my only comments around it.
Okay. And then the last thing I'll say on that before we move on, and I think we might be ready to wrap up part 1 of McRaney, is that, we're also, as data science professionals, optimally equipped to overcome a lot of this stuff. Mm-hmm. So yeah, like I likened it to drunk driving an 18-wheeler, but we can also soberly drive an 18-wheeler and haul goods, whereas the other, in the mathematical space, a lot of our counterparties are on the bicycles. Okay, they can still get from point A to point B, but they're not going to haul, a shipping container's worth of stuff, right? And so, confirmation bias, availability heuristic, anchoring, overfitting, hindsight. Well, if we're not vigilant, we can commit them in a very aggressive way. But if we are aware of them, we can nip them in the bud, and we know we have mechanisms to check for all of this stuff, right? And so that's probably where it's kind of like our, not to use the cliche of like, okay, what's your biggest weakness? And you turn it into like, it's because I work too hard, like those like fake weakness strength questions. But we have like, when you're operating at the top of your capability, you can be very aware of these, avoid them, but then you could also preempt them in others because you're sensitive to them and you're aware of them. And to have a little bit of humility, especially when like overfitting bias, for example, right? I live by all models are wrong, but some models are useful, right? I just built a model that deals with pricing. It blows up at the tails. I can't figure out why, but there's so much between the tails, like the 5th to 95th percentile. There's so much, it's so successful. So I just got to figure out how to either minimize the damage of the tails so that they don't cause any outsized impact to the business, or figure out a way to dial up the middle, which seems to be highly performant, right? So I know the model's not perfect, so I have to come over the model and kind of overrule the model, override the model. But I also know that the model's useful because it does help separate good opportunities from bad opportunities. People bring that kind of a mindset, like my model helps make better decisions, but it can't be the sole decider. Now you're cooking with gas. And that's because you knew, okay, I'm prone to overfitting. Other people might be prone to overfitting. Let me build some checks and balances into it. And because we're the chefs, like we're the authors, we can build in the checks and the balances, right? So that's why, I don't want to bludgeon the data science community and then leave them hanging, right? By the way, guys, like you're also super well equipped to overcome this. Please do so. Right.
The only thing I'd add there, because so you said that have a little bit of humility. So I might caveat that of like a little bit is not enough, because it's being thrown around thrown around a lot. It's like like just be humble, and sometimes it like triggers me because just saying just be humble is like such like a cliche advice. And it triggers me because I think it doesn't do it justice. Like humility is the most practical thing that you can have in order to just succeed in your profession. It's these two things. It's like, being assertive or humble. These are like at odds with each other, and it's not true at all, right? In fact, like the more they are almost like force multipliers to each other. When you can learn how to be assertive and at the same time, like always, like be open and approach these conversations with that kind of collaborative approach. And without humility, it won't exist. So even in our own organization, right? So I tend to have strong opinions, and it really, like, actually building a business and leading a business, it's a great, like, humbling experience in general, if you let it happen. And the tangible benefits of that, like on the bottom line, on client satisfaction, on internal alignment, just how enjoyable it is to work, it just goes through the roof. So I know that you also need to go soon, but we just had that case study from Kate Goodine, the head of marketing analytics at Miro, and she used to work at Expedia, and she really took that culture of experimentation and implemented it at Miro, and we kind of unpacked it. And
nice.
The idea that you can kind of propagate a culture of experimentation, which by definition is about everyone being in that posture of humility to be open to learnings, and then on the practical level of how to have kind of the skills and the habit of conducting these effective experiments when you operate based on certain hypotheses that are easy to test and isolated. That's like the skill part of it, right? But it is embedded in that culture of humility. And back to the data scientist thing, that's again, we talked about this, but it's really difficult to be humble when you have an IQ of 150 and a PhD in data science. And how do you then take that posture of humility? And you can decide not to, right? But then all the stuff that we're talking about, you will be just as or more prone to it than your stakeholders, who you assume to be. So yeah, that would be my comment. That one of the key takeaways here is humility on a very practical and actionable level.
Agreed. And two things on that notion of humility. We're just going to keep pulling on that thread for a minute, right? So the first is, Voss talks about mirroring. So if you're not going to be humble, your counterparty will not be humble, especially if you come across as prideful. Because then it's like, well, if you're going to walk around with your ego on your sleeve, they'll do the same thing. The analytic professional is often in the subordinate position. So if you're going to have a battle of egos, you're going to lose. At the end of the day, you're probably going to lose, right? And then to tie this into how minds change, which we'll talk about next, is if you're not in that humility mode, you don't have space to learn. And learning, whether it's for yourself, to persuade yourself, or to persuade someone else, like there has to be an air of humility. And that's what the experimentation really is. The experiment is a tacit willingness, a tacit consent to have your mind change. Because a good experiment is a falsifiable hypothesis. I think this is going to happen. I do an experiment. It didn't happen. Well, shit, that wasn't correct. We need to update the model. So to be an experimenter is to be humble, because you're making space to learn. And that sets you up for a mind change, whether it's your own or someone else's, because you could usually get them to come. Most people would say yes to an experiment because it's low risk. But if you can get them there, they're already kind of implicitly in this place where they're ready to learn.
100%. And there is a reason why, in the days of old, pride was called the father of all vices, and then humility is the queen of all virtues. And just a very quick tidbit on that Dejan Mitkovsky, VP of Data Analytics at FanDuel, he's been on the podcast twice. Great guy. And then he says that on his team, he has an incentive to the biggest mistake or like a falsified hypothesis that was proposed. So if you are on that team, there's a special prize that you can win if you had your hypothesis falsified, right? You propose something and then it's incentivized to lean into that. It's being rewarded.
I'd love to get case studies on that. Maybe we can back channel.
Well, there are a few things that we're working on with Dejan, and you'll find out. You'll find out.
Oh, okay. I'm not the only one in your special inner circle of data storytellers. Okay. I'm humble.
We have an all-star team.
I get it. I'm humble enough to know I'm not the only one. All right. On that note, sir, let's wrap it up. So we've got 2 books. You Are Not So Smart. You Are Now Less Dumb. They're both by Dave McRaney. They're absolute joys to read. They will give you upwards of 30 different explanations for why that damn croc brain does what the croc brain does. Okay, that cognitive miser. Okay, they're modular. You don't have to read them in order, and you don't have to sit and try to get cover to cover. You could jump in and out. They are perfect airplane books. All right, if you ever come out to Boston to hang out, perfect for airplane books. And they're just fascinating to read. And I think, when we talk about here's what could go wrong in a meeting, this opens up the black box for one of those big traps. And once you know about this, you could open up your own black box so you don't make the mistakes, but you can prepare to get around other people's black box. And so go pick those up, and that'll help set you up for kind of the culmination of the book reviews, which will be How Minds Change, which we'll do next time.
Amazing, sir. Well, right after we hang up, I'm pressing the button on I'm pressing the purchase button, and yeah, this was fascinating. Loved it. Actually, it connected way more things than I anticipated, and I anticipated that it will. It's almost like I think it's influence level in terms of how this underpins everything that we usually talk about on the technical level. So I'm very excited to see how that will manifest itself in the synthesis.
Right on, man. All right. Well, always a pleasure, sir.
It was a pleasure. Have a good one, and I'll see you very soon.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Take care.